Well, you probably noticed that today's theme throughout all of our readings and through our collect is the theme of answering God's call. Important message for us as Christians. And appropriate that today we are observing our parish annual meeting where we will do some of that. We will do some of that listening to God's call. And also appropriate that yesterday our diocese celebrated the ordinations of the new deacons in the Diocese of Arizona. And those new deacons, by the way, are familiar to us. They spent some time doing their training here at St. John. So they spent some time liturgically with us. And ordinations are something that I hope is meaningful to everyone. I hope the laity and the ordained together. But in a special way, ordination ceremonies are meaningful and special to those of us who are ordained because it can bring us back to when we went through that same process and had that same ceremony. Right? And priests go through an ordination process twice. We have to be ordained deacons, and then the canons require us to serve as deacons for at least 6 months. Sometimes it's more. Here in Arizona, they usually prefer a year, but the canons say at least 6 months, and then we are ordained into the priesthood, and those are separate ordinations. It's not a continuous event. Those are two separate ordination services. And because this was a diaconal ordination, it reminded me of the day I was ordained a deacon. That was June 16th, 2016, and it was a Thursday in the afternoon, and it was a very hot day in Salt Lake City. Now, if I say 105 degrees, we live in Arizona, 105 degrees, not that big a deal, but in Salt Lake City, in a cathedral with no air conditioning, 105 degrees is pretty hot. And I was wearing my black clericals for the very first time. And of course, it was the first time I got to wear them. So of course I was wearing a suit coat and the whole deal. So I was dressed all in black in this new polyester clothing, and it didn't breathe terribly well. And then during the service, I had my alb on, and then halfway through the service after I was ordained, someone put a dalmatic on me, which is similar to this, except it has sleeves instead of no sleeves. So now I'm wearing multiple layers on a very hot day, and all I remember is just dripping in sweat, thinking, boy, this is a little unpleasant, but I'm trying to be joyful because it was joyful. But what was interesting about that day was that after the ordination took place, and I took my place up behind the altar, the service started with the ordinands down in the pews, and then after the ordination, the ordinands come up behind the altar. And I remember looking out over the congregation and thinking, now what? Because it was interesting to me because I was now a deacon in the church, but I wasn't called to be a deacon. I was called to be a priest. And of course, by virtue, I had to be called to be a deacon because that's a step along the way. So I had to be called to be a deacon in that respect, but I wasn't really called to serve as a deacon. And so what it felt like to me was that I was a priest who was not authorized to celebrate the sacraments, the Eucharist. And so there's a debate among priests, people who have gone through that ordination day twice. Which ordination day is more special? Is it the diaconal ordination, because that's the day that you become an ordained person? Or is it the priesthood ordination, because that's the day that you are affirmed into the ministry to which you are called? And I think the answer is both. Both ordinations are important. Now, people ask me all the time, how did you know you were called to be a priest? And the answer is it's kind of complicated, because in a certain way, I always knew. And in a certain way, I always knew that I wasn't. Right? I had no context of being an Episcopal priest because I didn't grow up in the Episcopal Church. So I certainly, when I was young, did not know that I was going to be called to be an Episcopal priest. And I certainly didn't think I was going to be a Roman Catholic priest because I didn't feel called to live the single life, a life of celibacy. And so there was no context for it when I was younger. But at the same time, there was always some kind of a tug that was there, some kind of a nudging that was there. And without context, I didn't have a way to articulate it. You may remember in the book of the prophet Jeremiah, Jeremiah is told by the Lord, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you." And that lays the groundwork for our sacrament, or our theology of the sacraments. Because sacraments are not magic tricks. When those ordinations took place yesterday, the bishop didn't make those people new deacons. Those people already were deacons. They were given that grace by God. And what the ordination service itself does is allows the community to gather and to say, yes, we acknowledge that this person has gifts and that this person is a deacon in the church. And the same is true for baptism. Baptism doesn't magically make someone a Christian. The baptism ceremony takes place in the church up front. That's why the font is here, because the community gathers together to say, yes, we affirm that this person is a Christian. And a wedding works the same way. We don't make those two people married together. Those two people have grace in their lives that's given to them by God, and we as a community gather to affirm that we have seen and felt that that grace exists. And so we get to affirm that together. And that is our sacrament, or that's our theology of the sacraments. God knew when he created us what he called us to do. And these sacramental rites, in a lot of ways, can be rites of passage. So they're important to us. How many different rites of passage do we have in our lives? We have a lot. We have graduation ceremonies, right? We talked about weddings, right? We have sweet 16 parties. Those are big rites of passage, right? Retirement parties, when someone retires from their career. And all of these rites of passage mark times in our lives. And they are important for us to celebrate and to mark. And the sacraments do essentially the same thing. Right? The sacramental rites, the pouring on of water in baptism, the laying on of hands in ordination, the exchange of the rings in marriage, those are rites of passage. And the community gets to come together to say, yes, we affirm that this is true. And in today's gospel, Jesus calls Simon and Andrew and James and John to follow him. Now, is it easy for these guys to say yes when Jesus comes along and says, hey, you, follow me. Drop what you're doing. Come with me. You're coming with me. And I would say probably not. If I were sitting, minding my own business, fishing, and somebody came up to me and said, hey, Tim, come on, let's go. You're going with me. I'm like, what are you, nuts? But they said yes. They dropped what they were doing, and they followed Jesus. And so that tells us that it may not be easy to say yes, but it's important. It sure is important for us to say yes. Now, why is it difficult for us to say yes if we are called to serve? And I think a big part of that is that sometimes we don't always feel those words of affirmation. We don't always feel that the community rallies behind us and raise us up to do those things, right? Sometimes, let's be honest. Sometimes, as a priest, people don't always agree with the way things are done, or maybe I make a decision that people don't like, and sometimes people can be vocal about those kinds of things, and sometimes I second guess myself. Sometimes I have ideas that I think are really great, and they fall flat on their face, and they don't work, and sometimes that can be a letdown. Right? And that's true for all of us in our different roles, in our different callings. I think those words of affirmation are helpful for us, and at the same time, negative voices can have a heavier impact on us than we could hear 20 people say, "Hey, I love how you did that," and we hear one person say, "That wasn't so good," and that one person kind of sticks with us more. Is that the case? Is that the case? It's the case for me. And so we might ask the question, why don't you join the choir? And maybe the answer is, well, at some point in my life, someone heard me singing and said I was a bad singer, and so my feelings were really hurt, and so I just don't want to put myself out there anymore. That's a real thing, right? That really happens, and those things stick with us, right? Maybe somebody told us one time, or we might say, "Hey, why don't you serve as a lector?" And someone might say, "Well, I remember back when I was in 5th grade and we had to read aloud and I tripped over a word and I said the wrong word and the whole class laughed at me." Right? Those are real things. Those things stick with us, right? But they don't necessarily mean that they're true. And I think the lesson for us as a community is that we want to raise up one another, and we want to affirm each other's gifts. And sometimes it can be more impactful for someone else to point out our gifts than it would be for us to recognize our gifts on our own. Sometimes when we hear it from other people, maybe we believe it a little better than we might believe it if we say it to ourselves while we're looking in the mirror. And Jesus, to these disciples, said, "Hey, you're the one I want. Yes, you. Come, follow me." That's what Jesus said to those 4 disciples. And he says the same thing to us. And so we're going to do a little exercise here together. I'm going to invite us to get out of our comfort zones just a little bit. Just a little bit. In a moment, not right now, but in a moment, I'm going to ask you to take some time and find maybe 2 or 3 of your fellow parishioners who maybe you don't talk to that often. And I want you to tell them what it is that you affirm about them and their gifts. What it is that you admire about them. And I want you to bless that person for who that person is. Now, I'll give you an example of what I mean by blessing that person for who they are. Yesterday, when I went to the ordination service, I decided, well, this is an important service. I am going to dress, I'm going to look like a priest today. I'm going to wear my nicest black slacks and my nicest black dress shoes, and I'm going to wear a black collared shirt, and because this is important. I'm going to show that I care. And when I got to the cathedral, no fewer than 10 people, including our bishop, asked me why I wasn't wearing an aloha shirt. Our bishop said, "Are you trying to tell me that you didn't have a fancy red aloha shirt that we could use to celebrate the coming of the Holy Spirit?" And here I was thinking I had done the right thing, but here is the Diocese of Arizona blessing me for who I am, acknowledging, like, hey, why don't you be yourself? Don't try to be someone you're not. Not that that's somebody I'm not, but they're blessing me for who I am, for expressing myself in a way that's meaningful to me. So sometimes it can be helpful for us to become made aware of our gifts and talents when they're told to us by other people. So now I invite you to interact with one another and find a couple of people and just affirm those people. So take some time. Go ahead and do that now. Okay, let's make our way back to our seats. We have lots of affirmations going on. Let's make our ways back to our seats. Lots of affirming, lots of affirming. So I have a question for you. We could have kept, well, I noticed that, but we have food. We want to get to the food, so I don't want to take too much of your time. We can do lots of more affirming after the service. We can continue to affirm. But I have a question for you. Who here heard something that was surprising Was anyone given some news that was surprising? Okay, a few of us, okay. How many of you felt good about having those affirmations? It probably feels pretty good. Were any of those affirmations, were those maybe about things that maybe we were self-conscious about? No? We didn't quite have enough time to get into that amount of depth, but sometimes that can happen, right? So if I didn't give you enough time? Oh. Well, like I said, lots of time after the service. But we can learn a lot from one another. And sometimes it requires a little bit of vulnerability. But sometimes people tell us things that are surprising to us. Sometimes people see us in ways that maybe we don't see ourselves. And I think it's important for us to hear those affirmations. I think it's important to be able to look at things in a slightly different way. And now it's my turn. It's my turn to affirm you as this parish community, because I'm impressed by everything that you do. I'm impressed by everything that you do in ministry and everything that you do to say yes when Jesus calls you. Okay? And everyone in this room, I want you to know this, everyone here is loved. You are loved and you are beloved. And every one of you was known by God before you were formed in your mother's womb. And every one of you has very important gifts that make you an important member of the church and an important minister in the church of God. Today we are going to have our annual meeting. And there is an opportunity for us to continue to discern our gifts together. And I think it's important that you hear me say that those gifts are valuable gifts. And this is a parish that does what Jesus wants you to do. Right? You feed the hungry in many different ways. You clothe the naked in many different ways. You remember the imprisoned. You care for the sick. You do all of the things that Jesus asks you to do. You do all of this and so much more. And so it's important that you hear me say thank you. Thank you for being the church in the world, and thank you for saying yes to Jesus' call. It's important for you to hear me say that your priest affirms you, and God affirms you. And so when you hear the voice of Jesus calling, I want you to say yes. Amen.